All of my friends are dead. All of my me are dead. Hey there, listeners! You might have been experiencing a few relatively minor power outages today, but over here we're run off a generator, and over there where you are, most radios are going to be those little portable AM FM RONs that are run off batteries. The ones that everyone used to laugh at for how quaint they looked when everyone had a mobile phone, but hey, the world ended, and now it's the durable stuff that really matters. Welcome to Vermont Stretch Radio. Sit down, joke around, and listen in to a public radio show broadcast just after the city shuts down the power for the night. I'm in a bit of a mood today, listeners. Not that I sound it, but I am. Well, some personal news to start off with. Brain King sent in another letter that I didn't get around to reading recently. One that I'm just reading now. They've sort of been cut out of old newspapers and magazines that survived Gold Morning, signed with a little doodle of a brain. It's nice to get mail, even if it is cut and stitched together. Actually, I think the personal touch really helps on that. It seems a bit more sort of arts and craftsy. Ignoring the terrible, terrible prospect, of course, that a former villain is corresponding with me, of course. I in no way endorse the actions of the European stranger that was arrested for murder only to escape from the custody of those meddling kids in PRT gear and the teleporting assistant of his that slew a strew of meddling kids in PRT gear. Oh, I should probably explain them to any new listeners. That's Brain King, listeners. The Stranger 2, Thinker 4, Person Who Cares About Powers Ratings 9 that I've had a bit of light-hearted correspondence with. Now reunited, of course, with one of their old friends from back in the day, some mover-breaker sort that can create or destroy objects and mucks about with portals of their own. They'd helped to break Brain King out on the very same day that the portals of Earth-Bait were opened that smidge wider. The two of them are off to Europe, actually, to get the rest of the band back together, it seems, and while I am glad that they are getting away from the hustle and bustle of Megacity Gimel, I am somewhat concerned by their seeming ability to reach Europe, as I was unaware that transcontinental travel was a thing these days. Brain King, good on you if you're listening in. As for getting your team back together, though, I would strongly recommend against that, as much as the idea of meeting up with old friends, going back to the way things were, going back to that confusion and that wondrous melee of swung fists and slashing blades, the sound of the screams of bystanders who knew that whoever would win, they would lose. As appealing as that all is, I recommend against it. I don't know what to recommend in favor of it, going cold turkey myself. It's hard, but trying to go hero, maybe, that might be an idea. Fill in the gaps with fighting the bad guys, though that's just a half measure that will probably see you back on the streets puncturing people's throats in no time, as I did the other week. It seems being a force for justice really, really doesn't agree with me. Not in a way that you won't see me going back to the way things were. It's just not fun. Brain King, I am glad to hear from you, but I have to ask, I don't know. Have a good time, Brain King. No, I'm being friendly with a villain. That's probably against some law or other. Don't have a good time, Brain King, you reprehensible villain, you. There, that's everyone up to date with my favorite villain. I'm definitely not my favorite villain, my favorite nemesis, yes? I don't agree with Brain King at all. Let's just move on to less stressing news. Terrorism. A form of justice. A vile and dubious justice that rewards whoever can be bothered to write history and condemns those that let their deeds speak for them to an ignoble and slow death. Following a warm-up trial. Sorry, this is justice news. Now I appear to have gotten my notes messed up. Justice news. Following a warm-up trial Former Slaughterhouse 9 member Damsel of Distress was found guilty of being just enough of a problem to justify actually going to a real trial after her recent murder of murderer Beast of Burden, as opposed to any of her actual crimes. You know, like maiming innocent civilians, grotesque property damage, murdering innocent civilians, conspiracy to commit modern art, and being a clone, the latter three of which all carry a death sentence in the old legal system. Far be it from me to find that focusing on a trial has made surprisingly less headlines than you'd think. One of those bizarre things, really. Nobody seems to be talking about Damsel of Distress's arrest or the fact that she is a member of the Slaughterhouse 9. Far be it from me to talk about the shaky early career that saw Damsel struggling to find work until her late 2011 recruitment into the big leagues. But I would like to use this as an opportunity to actually discuss law, or the legal system that we all find ourselves in. Not that hokey backcountry, the strong rule the weak law that the wardens just sat back and let grow all around them and every little world connected except their precious Earth Gimel, where supposedly we live under more civilized terms. I'm talking about their own legal system, the legal system that has survived them and their own passing. Let's go back in time just a little bit, listeners, back in time to just after Gold Morning. Our legal system, with the wardens still around. Let's go back to the 10%, to stiff-collared lawyers and slightly less stiffly-collared law students. It's a few months since the end of the world. Most of the S-class threats have all been imprisoned or given jobs. All of the birdcage's most dangerous residents are either dead or they're no longer cooped up in the biggest waste of American taxpayer dollars since NEPEA 5. A few scattered threats are hanging around, but for the most part, Gimel seems safe and secure. But the courts are empty. A system is put in place. Only the top 10% of crimes will actually get a court hearing. And what are those top 10% mostly comprised of? Cape on Cape violence, Cape on civilian violence, civilian on Cape violence, civilian on civilian violence. Noticing a pattern here? Now, let's ask what crimes are actually ignored under this little policy of theirs. Conspiracy to establish monopoly. Illegal appointment of a monolithic authority of villains. The formation of a single corporate entity that has consolidated most of the media in the most terrifying stranglehold on the entertainment industry since the BBC. Political corruption, as Sierra Kiley, the candidate for mayor and known associate of the criminal organization The Undersiders, an organization, mind, that had declared themselves the rulers of a sovereign US territory 4 years ago, and nobody actually seems to have done anything about that even now. They're still in charge of Brockton Bay. Attempted kidnapping, assault, destruction of public property. That's all just Lord of Loss, one attack, the Norfair disaster. No public consequences despite his public status and publicly known location. You can find him anytime you like. A normal person can go out and find and speak to Lord of Loss, and the wardens did nothing about a terrorist attack on an Earth Gimel settlement. Just because a man shot a former villain on the scene, and that just took hold of the public perception. Incidentally, that's why our intern, Nora James, decided to call herself the Norfair Disaster, not because heroes shouldn't be shot, and not just to make some dumb political statement, but because a hero being shot was enough to make people forget that an entire community center was mastered, used as weapons, that said community center was nearly demolished, that the villains had planted explosives, and that known villains were freely allowed to enter and leave Earth Gimel. Known and unrepentant villains. What makes Lord of Loss different from Nilbog? If the Sleeper walked out of Earth Zion and asked for amnesty, would we lock him up in jail, or would we just give him a job? Let him take over Earth Zion and start trading with us. Send people over on vacations. That's today's first important moral dilemma. I guess we could go to something a little more light-hearted to break up this in our next serious discussion, something a little more Master Strangery. I'm planning on bringing it back, listeners. We're going to be bringing you a few more horror stories from the wider Cape community. A sort of expansion of Master Stranger Month. Ones that you haven't heard of and ones that you have heard of. Just give us a little bit longer to dig some more stuff up. For now, though, more on just how corrupt and vile a world we all live in. Now, I've gone and I've checked in with foresight after receiving one of those "we'll be watching" sort of letters that they all like to hand out, which is weird because I'm a hero organization these days, and because it seems like they didn't actually respect Nora James's choice of Cape name. Any mention of the Norfair disaster has been replaced with No Fair, which to me sounds like another example of the heroes rejecting names considered too political or too rude, like Bitch, the troubled teen turned troubled runaway hounded by the police, turned villain turned warlord. A little odd on that one to just call her Hellhound when she's very specifically laid out her name. We don't go around calling Alexandria Alexandra now, do we? Just because we don't like Alexandria. I don't think you can just take away someone's name, listeners. This is literally a week after Splatterhorse decapitated her former PR manager. Well, less decapitated, more reduced the rest of his body to a fine paste. The head was the only intact bit. They also list me as Guy. Guy's my last name. That's Mr. Guy. You can't give someone a Cape name if they aren't using one. If they just have a name, you shouldn't give them a Cape name and force away their identity. That's dehumanizing them, and that's actually against a lot of the rules that you abide by. So today I'm going to respect Foresight's decision to allow nicknames by giving them one of their own. After all, I have the utmost respect for Don't Mention Watchdog and their willingness to put that whole time they all fled the sinking ship of the Protectorate like rats behind them. That's Foresight, which I will now be referring to as Don't Mention Watchdog. You know, I always wondered, really, what the difference was between when a government-approved hero decided to kick in a villain's door and when a former Birdcage resident and folk hero named Gavel had decided to kick in a villain's face. Getting ahead of myself, listeners, you probably have next to no clue who either of these people/organizations are. So, Foresight. Foresight is a group of capes these days formed shortly after Gold Morning. They're looking to the future with a lot of thinkers, masters, and strangers that really want to escape their past, but in that let's just make the exact same mistakes kind of way. So let's look at where they come from. Watchdog. The Protectorate/PRT's Oversight Committee. Sort of. They were a collection of government agents dismissed or quietly given lateral promotions from the FBI and the CIA that were then given absolutely no power over the assortment of masters, thinkers, and strangers that were expected to investigate the Protectorate for corruption. Interestingly enough, most of them quit the exact second, or possibly several seconds before, for the precogs among them, that Chevalier managed to announce himself as the face of the new Protectorate, gently stepping, of course, over the asphyxiated corpse of the face of the old Protectorate. Now, some of the iconic members of Watchdog were Accord, who was nearly investigated by their Internal Affairs Department before he elected to resign and take up supervillainy, and no one else. The majority of them were just pathetic weasels whose job consisted of being kept out of the way, accepting bribes from the elite, paying bribes to the elite, and enforcing NEPEA 5 in increasingly unjustified ways. Sometimes, of course, the Protectorate would ask them to uncover a villain's real name, or to highlight a villain's psychological weaknesses, or to deliver a PowerPoint presentation on Master Stranger powers in the workplace. But really, that's the sort of thing any office clerk with a failed degree in parahuman studies can do. By contrast, Gavel was an Australian man who broke down villains' doors and beat them to death with a hammer. Now, one of these was acceptable, and the other of them was sent to the birdcage. Large-scale corruption, negligence, and violent violent perturbation of the law and the public's trust, or one guy doing vigilante justice. That's a little odd to me, listeners. Why is this? Well, the answer at Gavel's trial was, of course, that he was breaking the Cape Code. You know, that badge of honor where a criminal's personal lives were considered off limits. The personal lives that, were they any ordinary criminal, would have been considered fair game. There's a reason Gavel called himself Gavel. He considered himself a force for justice, and justice means that justice is blind. He's not with us anymore, having given his life fighting Scion. Not sure if that was willingly or not, but I would call it a noble sacrifice. Not that he had a choice to have been there or not. Odd one. You see, he was locked in a prison that relied on the outside world for food. He was serving a worse-than-life sentence, where people were knowingly sent into an environment where a Welsh supervillain would steal their soul for all eternity the second that they died. I'm honestly surprised no villain just stepped out of the birdcage only to spit in Chevalier's smug face. But then again, the new Protectorate really did love to recruit people without giving them a choice. Join the Wardens, join the Wards, or face Juvie. Join the Protectorate, or face the birdcage. Save the world, or be left inside to die. The only real hypocrisy there about that whole thing is their willingness to excommunicate their precious poster child the second she extended the same choice to them. One really must admire the integrity and virtue it takes to condemn someone for just taking your exact values, your exact virtues, the things you praise the most, to their logical conclusion. It's only reasonable, isn't it? Am I crossing the line now? Am I entering that 10% of criminals by daring to speak my mind? When is the broadcast going to get cut off? When is the man wearing a stolen uniform stained with detergent-resistant blood of my intern's mother? When do they get dragged out of their station by some man in tights and primary colors? Pixie boots to my jackboots. Oh, it says something about this world that telling the truth is sure to land me in trouble and going back to killing people. Nobody even cared. I described on air that I stabbed a man in the throat and you didn't care. They didn't care. Because he was a criminal. Because it's justice. Oh, thanks for tuning in, listeners. I'm sure there's more happy happenings to report on next time, but for now, good night. This is your host signing off. Theodore Guy, a man with no birth certificate, no driver's license, no permit for firearms, not that I need any of them. I can't shoot, I can't drive, and I was never born. Long story on that last one. Cape stuff. A funny story too. Legally speaking, the old PRT guidelines refuse to classify me as human. You might think that's unique, but under the old PRT guidelines, these are guidelines, mind, that haven't even been changed by reforms under the new Protectorate or the Wardens. I'm not a human being, and neither are a large number of victims across Earth Gimel and its associated Earths. Something I share with anyone alleged to have been influenced by the Simurgh. Note that that's not confirmed victims of the Simurgh. That's anyone that a source of authority judges to be a Simurgh victim. You know, just like Alexandria. That wording is important because it excuses any source of authority from this. The legal precedent is biased in the favor of capes, and it allows people like Alexandria to go 10 or 15 times the time limit of influence, so long as she says, no, I'm immune to the Simurgh's influence. Well, allegedly, she spent decades trying to sabotage and undermine the PRT, and she was allowed to go free until they decided, well, actually, we're going to kill her now. While civilians that were within the quarantine zone beyond a certain point, or even well before that certain point, they were just forced to stay in that quarantine zone for the rest of their lives, or until gold morning at least. Have a look around at some of your neighbors. They might actually have been escapees. I don't think they're going to be happy with the people that were willing to let them be locked up. Yeah, there's a lot of people in that sort of situation. Good night, listeners. Da, 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 da. This was a recording made for the Parahuman Audio Community Content section. Parahuman Audio is where the Worm audiobook, the Ward audiobook, is hosted. The Worm audiobook is hosted elsewhere. It's done by Rain, who is a delightful sort and is willing to host us on there. So you are probably already on Parahuman Audio if you're listening to this, but I still take the time to recommend it. This script was beta read by Kittius, a very nice sort, and possibly one of the friendliest people I know. And Worm and Ward, though, they are all the property of J.C. McCrae, alias Wildbow. Find them and support them on Patreon. It's what I do for a piddly sum a month, but every little helps and is their main source of income. And of course, thank you for listening in. You can find more of Vermont Stretch Radio right here on Parahuman Audio, or you can just browse it around online. You'll be able to find us by just searching in Vermont Stretch Radio, because I don't actually think there is anything else with that name. But if not, just check us out on Space Battles or Sufficient Velocity, where we have the script for this episode and all the episodes that came before it. Thanks, listeners, and we'll just stop recording here, shall we? C'est pas une pipe.